One of the most encouraging trends for me within Protestantism in recent times has been the excitement around church history. It's something that is especially seen on my channel and the kind of corners of the internet that you probably inhabit if you watch my videos. And this happens on multiple levels. It's not just on the theological level, but also on the devotional or spiritual level. What I mean by this is we have figures like Dr. Gavin Ortlund, who has done a lot around theological retrieval for evangelicals. That's one of the titles of his books, right? But the idea that we should be going back to the theology of the fathers to enrich our theology and to see them as people who we can claim as our own in a sense as well. And then there's also figures like John Mark Comer, who with his Practicing the Way and several of his books has really been delving into the spirituality of the early church and encouraging evangelicals to experience it themselves. And I think this is all fantastic. And these are both people individually and movements more generally that I've personally benefited from. However, I was recently reading an article from a former guest on this show, Dr. Brad East, who I had a wonderful time talking to, and it's a great article, I'll link it below, in which he remarked that all of his students are reading John Mark Comer. And he's like, what's going on here? And he was excited to see that these students were interested in fasting and they were interested in spiritual disciplines. He's like, this is great. I've got to read this guy. And he didn't have high hopes. He thought he'd maybe be kind of like celebrity pastor vibe, but he got into him and he's seeing him quote Evagrius and St. John of the Cross and the Cappadocian Fathers and thinking, wow, this is really substantial. But he noticed that one thing was missing from this writing about the early church. And I think a lot of people also, when they look at the theological side, they say, wow, this seems good, but something seems to be missing. I know that's been my own experience, whether it's on the theological side of retrieving the theology of the church fathers, or it's on the spiritual side of, over the last year, my wife and I have gone through his Practicing the Way curriculum. And it's been great for us. But there's this sinking suspicion that something isn't being said. And that's what I want to talk about in this video, specifically some of the challenges that evangelicals and low church Protestants face when they try to retrieve church history and to find in the church fathers people that they can call their own and people that they can fashion their lives and their practice of faith after. Okay, so let's start on the theological level. When I think about this, I'm taken back to a comment that my dear friend Keith Little, he hosts the Cordial Catholic podcast, which is a wonderful show. He said to me, and he also said it in an interview with Dr. Ortlund as well, and it's been a question that I haven't been able to get out of my head for the past 4 or 5 years at this point. And it was a simple one. The question was simply, which of the church fathers could be a pastor at your church? Because for all of the talk that we have about learning from the church fathers and wanting to be in continuity with them, right, and have this organic connection to the past and a rootedness in tradition, even as Protestants, this question puts a pin on it that is very difficult because for most of us, and I don't want to misrepresent Gavin, but to the best of my ability, I remember him essentially answering similarly as I'm going to here, is that not many, maybe none. And you might be thinking, well, that sounds extreme. I mean, certainly we're learning a lot from these people, right? Like, couldn't they be a pastor? But when you think about what it would take to be a pastor at your church, could they sign your doctrinal statement? Do they agree with your ecclesiology, your sacramentology? Do they agree with, what would they think of your liturgy? When you add all these things together, maybe they'd be okay with one thing or another, right? Maybe you can read the Cappadocians and discover incredible insights into Trinitarian theology. Maybe you can read Athanasius and think, wow, like my Christology is so much deeper and I can resonate with this. Or you read Augustine and you think, oh, what he's talking about, faith here, yes, that makes so much sense to me. But can you incorporate all of any of these men into your theology? Can you incorporate how they view the church, the sacraments? That's where it gets a lot more complicated, and it begins to put a limit and questions around what we mean by, are we retrieving the church? Can we really call them ours? Now, you're left with a couple options here when you run into this question specifically, which church father could teach at your church, if any. So one thing you could say is, well, no church father could teach at my church, but at least the apostles could, which is essentially like a type of sola scriptura, but it kind of sneaks in this idea of like a great apostasy, right? Where none of the church fathers until Luther, and well, probably not even Luther, but could none of them could teach at your church. And when I talk to people who are interested in historical theology, most really want to avoid this kind of theory of the great apostasy, a great falling away. But it's hard to not see a little bit of that when we say none of them could teach there. Now, there is another option, though. And the other option is to say, look, yeah, maybe none of them could teach at my church. And again, talking about kind of low church, evangelical, maybe Baptist settings here. But you'd say, and I don't think they could teach at any modern church. Now, this leaves you with kind of two ways of taking that. The first would be, again, kind of like a great apostasy type thing. Like, hey, all the churches today just look different than the early church, and that's just what it is. And the early church was wrong, and the churches today were right, perhaps, or maybe some of them are right today. I think the more common, though, path that you would take with this requires you to accept a certain form of doctrinal development in which you say, okay, so maybe they have some different emphases or whatnot, but they could teach in my church. Now, at this point, I do want to say where Protestants are coming from when they say, I don't think they could teach at any modern church, this is kind of the route that I think Dr. Ortlund takes in a lot of his material, because they say, sure, like our theology might be slightly different than the church fathers, but so is yours. And they say, like, would the ante-Nicene fathers be okay with your Mariology or your veneration of icons? And if Catholics answer, well, maybe not, okay, so we're back at development of doctrine, right? Which is fine, but we have to recognize what's going on there. Or a Catholic or Orthodox could say, no, I do think the ante-Nicene fathers would be okay with these things. And then that's where you get into these historical debates, which have taken up a lot of airtime on YouTube and gotten a lot of views, and is stuff I talk about on my channel and Dr. Ortlund talks about on his. Now, it's worth noting at this point, though, when we're talking about kind of continuity and discontinuity with the fathers, there does seem to be differences in degree here. So even if you grant that modern Orthodox theology or modern Catholic theology differs from the fathers in certain places, there's still a question of who bears a greater resemblance, right? And I think that most people, not all, but most would say that the fathers generally resemble these two traditions a little more, the Catholic and Orthodox, than they do anything that looks like a kind of low church Protestant. In other words, the fathers would probably feel a lot more at home in those traditions than they would at your local Baptist, evangelical, non-denominational church, or liberal mainline church for that matter. But there's another important question here, and in some ways this is like the question. And it's, even if we grant that there's some development here, how would the church fathers, these people that we all want to claim, that we all want to learn from, that we all want to say we're in connection with, how would they judge the developments that came later? Now, these are difficult questions, right? Because we don't know for sure. I mean, we can't take Augustine to the 15th century or the 16th century. We can't take the Cappadocians and bring them to the 10th century, right? Like, these things aren't possible, but we can get glimpses of this. And the question that it really is how would they measure them? Specifically, would they take an approach of, well, does it align with the scripture, going with kind of a sola scriptura principle here, because scripture is our ultimate authority, so we're going to test these doctrines by scripture, or are we going to test them more with the living tradition of the church, seen through the authority of the councils or maybe the Pope, right? That's the question we have to ask. And I really think that almost all ecumenical disagreements come down to two things, and that's one of them. A future video will talk about the other. But I think if you want to investigate something, that's probably the thing to investigate. But in summary, the challenge on the theological side is that while we can be inspired by the church fathers, it seems difficult to claim that any of the church fathers are truly our own, as there are too significant of disagreements that we have with them, as illustrated by the uncomfortable fact that maybe none of them could be pastors in your church. Okay, but what about the spiritual practice side? Someone like John Mark Comer, and this gets back to that article that Dr. Brad East wrote. So on the surface, surely there's nothing wrong with the way Comer and other Christians are calling Protestants back to more ancient practices of fasting and ways of prayer and generosity and other things like this. But here's where things get tricky once again. So it's not so much that what we find in these things, the things they're positively claiming that we should do, are bad. I think that aligns with the early church. These are good things. It's rather the surprising lack of one thing. It's that in Comer's, I think it's like 9 practices in practicing the way, and for all of his emphasis on the early church, the one thing you don't find is the sacraments. And why is that? Well, it's probably because most modern sacramental theology coming out of Protestant churches, specifically low church Protestants, well, it's not even sacramental, right? They wouldn't even talk about these as means of grace. But this is such a big point for the early church. I mean, I don't think it's a controversial idea to say that the Eucharist was central to the early church in their spirituality and their experience of following Christ. And not only was it the Eucharist, but this was a very ecclesially focused Eucharist. I mean, if you read Ignatius, the way he ties bishop and Eucharist together, you get to really uncomfortable places. But again, I think we're maybe being just a little, I don't want to say disingenuous, because that implies that we're trying to hide something. But I think as Protestants go back to the early church to try to retrieve things, there is a sense of you can't take it all because it doesn't all fit in that way. Now, you can have a higher view of the Eucharist, but can you have that high view of the Eucharist in the way that they did? This is where it gets tricky. What we see in the early church is you find an emphasis on fasting with the church, praying the church's words, receiving the sacraments in the church by duly ordained ministers in communion with the bishop. This is tough stuff, right? And so as Protestants, we find once again an ecclesiology rearing its head in objection to our continuity with the early church. Okay, so paths forward, because I'm a Protestant, so what am I saying all this for, right? This is messy. Okay, so what can Protestants do? On the one hand, I've intentionally focused on low church expressions because these have, in my opinion, the most tension with the early church. They have they're at odds the most with the witness that we see from the fathers, especially as we get into kind of like the patristic golden age, if you will, of the 4th and 5th centuries. It's often remarked on my friend who I love, Gavin Ortland's videos, but it's often remarked on his videos that it seems that sometimes when he's making more positive cases for Protestantism, it's an argument for something like Anglo-Catholicism or maybe a Lutheranism, although he's a Baptist who attends a non-denominational church, and people can be confused by that. To be fair, I think he's just showing that these things can exist within Protestantism, but I do think if you're trying to look for a path forward and you want to say, I want to be in continuity with the fathers, well, it probably, and you want to stay Protestant, it probably does look like something like becoming Anglo-Catholic. That's probably your best bet. However, there's an important thing to recognize, and it gets back to that kind of critical question. By the time you've made that move to become Anglo-Catholic, you might have given up, or at least thoroughly massaged, your idea of sola scriptura as the heartbeat of the Protestant Reformation. Or at least you've limited it, right, by focusing more on continuity with the tradition. And once you've made that decision, which is a fine thing to do, I think you have to recognize, though, you are kind of moving away from the Reformation in many ways, or at the very least, moving away from the ways the Reformation has been received historically. And so if you want to stay Protestant, it might look like becoming something that looks significantly less Protestant than you're used to. Maybe that's a better Protestantism. Maybe that's even a more faithful Protestantism. Those are all good questions, but I do think it will require change. The other option, of course, is you could become Catholic or Orthodox if you find their continuity claims compelling and you think continuity with the fathers over against maybe what your understanding of sola scriptura and using the scripture as it. And again, if you've become convinced, you probably think these things go together, but maybe you've kind of changed your paradigm and you think, yeah, I want to be in continuity with the fathers. I want to have this organic connection. And I think the fathers would have deemed maybe these things that develop later on as genuine and accepted the authority of the church. Cool. That's an option for you. But finally, I think one option too for Protestants is to simply be a little bit more modest. I love that there's a lot of emphasis on retrieving historical theology. I want people to do that. I personally found so much life in doing that. But I think we have to be a little honest about what we're doing. Early on in the Reformation, you'd see Calvin making claims like, we're just going back to the church of the first 4 centuries. I think that might be a little bit of a stretch. I think what we see throughout history is that claim kind of falls off a little bit and it becomes more of, okay, we're in line with the Church of the Apostles, because pretty quickly you're going to see things that get uncomfortable fast. I'm making a video on St. Cyril soon. And while St. Cyril's challenging to everyone, if you want to receive Cyril, you're going to get this very high ecclesiology. You're going to get prayers to the dead. And this is 4th century. This is his kind of commentary on the creed. What do we do with that? So do we want to say we're in continuity with him, or we have to go back even further? So I think one of the options for Protestants, and this is uncomfortable, and you have to decide if you're going to remain Protestant, if you're okay with this kind of thing, but is to say, hey, we're going to retrieve the best of the fathers. We're going to retrieve what we think is scripturally warranted, But ultimately, we can't take all of it. In which case, and maybe this is too bold, but the church fathers become less like a father with whom you have this organic connection and more like a church uncle, maybe a church stepfather. I don't know what metaphor you want to use there, and maybe I'm on shaky ground. But I do think that while we absolutely should learn as much as we can from the fathers, at some point a Protestant will have to decide, is my main goal to be in organic continuity with the fathers? Is that even possible? Does anyone have that? And if it is that, is that more important to me than maintaining this kind of posture of sola scriptura? And if you say yes to those things, you're probably not going to remain Protestant. I'm not losing sleep over that personally, but these are just some things to consider. I'm glad people are retrieving the fathers, but it's complicated, especially as a low church Protestant. So, buyer beware.